The retirement banquet was held in the community center's largest room. Folding chairs arranged in loose rows facing a small stage strung with simple paper decorations. And Iris Colton sat near the front, watching a room full of people sign to one another in the easy, rapid, overlapping way of a community that had spent decades together, waiting for the evening's honoree to be called up. She recognized perhaps a third of the faces in the room, colleagues her mother had mentioned over the years, clients whose weddings or graduations Genevieve had interpreted, a scattering of younger interpreters who had apparently trained under her mother's supervision at some point across 4 decades of practice. The room carried a specific warmth Iris hadn't fully anticipated, something closer to a family reunion than a professional retirement. The easy laughter and rapid conversation of people who had built genuine community around a shared language and a shared purpose. Her mother, Genevieve, had worked as a certified American Sign Language interpreter for 41 years. Hospitals, courtrooms, school board meetings, funerals, weddings, the entire unglamorous and essential architecture of a life spent standing quietly at the edge of other people's most important moments, translating between 2 languages so that nothing important would be lost in the space between them. Iris had grown up entirely accustomed to her mother's fluency, had absorbed basic signing herself simply through proximity, the way children absorb whatever language moves through their household daily, without ever once asking the question that suddenly, sitting in that folding chair, struck her as strange. She had never asked at all. "Why did you start?" A woman near the front stood to speak, an older interpreter named Faye, who had apparently worked alongside Genevieve for over 3 decades, and after describing Genevieve's steady excellence, her fierce advocacy for deaf clients in rooms that too often ignored them, Faye said something that made Iris go very still in her chair. "I remember when Genevieve first came to our study group, all those years ago," Faye said, signing as she spoke, her hands moving with the easy confidence of long practice. "She wasn't training for a career yet. She told us, very simply, that she was learning for her daughter. We assumed at the time she meant a daughter already at home, already needing the language. It took me years to understand she meant something else entirely, a daughter she was carrying, who she and her husband had learned, partway through the pregnancy, was very likely to be born deaf. She used to practice every single evening," she told me once, talking to her stomach in sign, preparing to raise a child fluently in both worlds, from the very first day. Iris felt something in her chest go tight, understanding, with a rising unease, that this story did not belong to her. She was 38 years old, the only child Genevieve had ever raised, hearing, unremarkable in every developmental way, and she had never once, in her entire life, heard any mention of a sister who might have come before her. She looked toward her mother, seated near the stage, watching the tribute unfold with an expression Iris found difficult to read, warm, composed, and underneath it, something considerably more complicated that Iris understood. In that exact moment, she had never once had the language to recognize before. Iris Colton was 38 years old, a physical therapist, married for 6 years to a steady man named Desmond, currently 11 weeks into her first pregnancy, a fact she and Desmond had shared with almost no one outside their immediate family, still cautious after a difficult first trimester that had included one frightening scare and a specialist's careful, ongoing monitoring. She had grown up in a household where sign language was simply part of the ordinary furniture of daily life, her mother signing along with the television, humming songs in sign at the stove while cooking, keeping a small library of deaf culture books on the shelf beside the ordinary family paperbacks. Iris had learned basic signs the way she'd learned to set a table or fold laundry, absorbed through repetition rather than formal instruction, understanding it simply as one of her mother's professional habits that had spilled over, comfortably, into home life. She remembered specific evenings from her own childhood, her mother signing entire bedtime stories alongside the spoken words, patient and unhurried, as though the practice mattered considerably more than any ordinary bedtime ritual required. She remembered, too, occasional visitors to the house who communicated entirely in sign, deaf friends and colleagues her mother welcomed, with the same warm, practiced ease she brought to every other part of her professional life. and Iris had simply understood these visits as an unremarkable extension of her mother's career, never once wondering what deeper current might be running beneath the surface of such consistent, careful devotion. She had never once considered that this fluency might have originated anywhere other than an ordinary, unremarkable career choice. A woman who happened to find sign language interesting, who happened to build a meaningful career around it, the way other parents build careers around accounting or teaching or medicine, without any deeper story required to explain the choice. Genevieve was 73 now, recently widowed. Iris's father, Roland, had died 3 years earlier, a sudden stroke that had given the family no real warning, and had announced her retirement from interpreting work the previous spring, citing simply that 41 years felt like the right amount of time to have given a profession she'd loved completely. Iris had not yet recognized, sitting in a folding chair at her mother's retirement banquet, with her own 11-week pregnancy still carefully unannounced beyond her closest family, exactly how directly her own quiet, private uncertainty about the coming months was about to be confronted by a story her mother had apparently carried, entirely unspoken, for nearly 40 years. Iris waited until they were home that evening, sitting together in her mother's kitchen with 2 cups of tea neither of them had touched, before she asked directly. "Faye said something tonight," she began carefully, "about a daughter. Before me. She said you were learning to sign for a baby you were expecting, one who was going to be deaf. I've never heard anything about this, Mom. Not once in my whole life." Genevieve was quiet for a long moment, her hands wrapped around her cup, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a specific, careful weight that Iris had rarely heard from her steady, composed mother. "Her name was Noor," Genevieve said. "I was pregnant with her 4 years before I had you. Your father's family carried a hereditary condition, several generations of profound deafness on his mother's side, going back further than anyone could properly trace. When the prenatal testing came back showing a very strong likelihood that our daughter would be deaf, we weren't devastated, the way I think some families might have been at the time. We were thrilled, actually. Your father had grown up with deaf cousins, deaf family gatherings, and he wanted, more than almost anything, to be able to raise our daughter fluently in a language he already had some connection to. I started learning the moment we got the results. Every evening, I'd sit with my hand on my stomach and practice signing to her, nursery rhymes, little stories, whatever I was learning that week in my classes." "What happened?" Iris asked quietly, already understanding, from the careful past tense of everything her mother had said, that the story did not end the way she had, for one brief moment, hoped it might. "I was 34 weeks along," Genevieve said, "a placental complication, sudden and severe, the kind that gives almost no warning until it's already an emergency. They got me to the hospital in time to save my own life. They couldn't save hers. I delivered her that same night. She never took a breath." Iris felt her own eyes fill, her hand moving instinctively to her own stomach, the specific, complicated collision of grief for a sister she'd never known, and a fresh, sharpened fear for the pregnancy she herself was so carefully, quietly carrying. "I don't understand why you never told me," she said. "Not even once. 34 years, and I never knew I had a sister." "I held her for a few hours before they took her," Genevieve continued, her voice steady but carrying a specific rawness that Iris understood had been kept carefully contained for decades. "I signed to her the whole time, the same little nursery rhymes I'd been practicing every evening for months, the ones I'd never gotten the chance to actually teach her. I don't know if that makes sense to you. I don't know if it needs to. I just knew in that room that I wasn't going to stop. Whatever else happened, I was going to keep the promise I'd started making to her, even though she wasn't here anymore to receive it directly." "Not right away," Genevieve said. "For the first year, I could barely bring myself to open the workbooks I'd been studying from. Your father found me, more than once, sitting with them closed in my lap, unable to make myself continue. It was one of the women from my original study group, actually, who finally convinced me to come back, told me that stopping wouldn't undo the loss, it would just add a second loss on top of the first. I went back the following spring. I finished my certification 2 years after that. I think, somewhere in that process, the studying stopped being only about Noor and became something I genuinely loved on its own terms as well. I don't think those two things ever fully separated, though. I don't think they were ever supposed to. Genevieve reached across the table and took Iris's hand, her own eyes bright now, unguarded in a way Iris had rarely witnessed across her entire life. I think, in the beginning, the grief was too large to hand to anyone, even the people who loved me most, she said. Your father and I barely spoke about it directly, even to each other, for the first several years. Not because we didn't love her or didn't grieve her completely, but because neither of us had any language adequate to the size of what we'd lost. I kept studying sign language anyway, through all of it. I think, at first, it felt like the only thing I could still do for her, finish what I'd started, even though she wasn't here to receive it. And then, somewhere along the way, it stopped being only about her and became something that was genuinely mine as well. A real skill, a real community, a real career I came to love completely on its own terms. But why keep it a secret from me? Iris asked. Once I was old enough to understand? I think I was afraid, Genevieve admitted, that if I told you, you'd always wonder whether you were somehow a replacement, whether I'd had you to fill the space she left, rather than because I wanted you specifically, exactly as you were. I think I decided, without ever fully examining the decision, that it would be simpler, kinder even, to just let the sign language exist as an unexplained fact of our household, rather than risk you growing up in the shadow of a sister you never got to actually know. Iris sat with this, understanding, with a complicated ache, both the love behind her mother's choice and the specific loneliness it had apparently required her to carry for nearly 4 decades. I don't think I would have felt like a replacement, she said slowly. I think I might have understood, even as a kid, that loving me and grieving her could both be true at the same time. I think not knowing actually cost me something too, even though I never realized it until tonight. I grew up thinking your whole devotion to this language was just an interesting career choice, when really it was the most important promise you ever made to anyone. I think you're right, Genevieve said quietly. I think I made the same mistake so many people make with grief, believing that protecting the people I loved from the size of it was the same thing as actually protecting them. I don't think it was. I think it just meant carrying it alone for considerably longer than I needed to. Iris told Genevieve about her own pregnancy that same evening, the confession arriving with more urgency now than she had originally planned, understanding, with a clarity that had settled over her across the preceding hour, exactly how much her mother's story had already begun reshaping her own private fears about the months ahead. I've been so careful not to let myself hope too much, Iris admitted. After the scare in the first trimester, I've been keeping everyone at arm's length, almost, telling myself I'm just being sensible, not letting myself get too attached until we're further along. I haven't decorated anything. I haven't let Desmond buy a single item of baby clothing, even though I know he wants to. I think, now, hearing about Noor, I understand where at least part of that instinct might actually be coming from. I think some part of me has always known, without ever being told directly, that pregnancy can go wrong in ways that don't ask permission first. Genevieve's expression moved through something complicated. Grief, still present after all these years, layered now with a fierce, immediate concern for her daughter's present circumstances. I don't think I can promise you nothing will go wrong, she said carefully. I wish I could. What I can tell you is that the fear itself doesn't have to be the only thing you carry through these months. I spent the years after losing Noor believing, in some private, unexamined way, that hoping too much the first time was somehow what had cost me, as though grief could be avoided through sufficient caution, rather than simply arriving, unpredictably, regardless of how carefully you tried to protect yourself from it. I don't think that belief ever actually served me. I think it just meant I spent longer than I needed to holding myself at a careful distance from my own life. How did you finally let yourself hope again? Iris asked. With me? Genevieve considered this seriously. I don't think I did, entirely not at first, she said. I remember being terrified through most of my pregnancy with you, waiting for something to go wrong the way it had before. I think what actually helped, more than anything, was your father insisting we keep learning sign language together anyway, even though we didn't yet know whether you'd need it. He told me more than once that continuing to prepare for you, regardless of what we didn't yet know, was its own way of choosing hope, even inside the fear. I think that's the only real answer I have. Not that the fear disappeared, just that we found a way to keep moving forward alongside it, instead of waiting for it to resolve completely before we let ourselves feel anything at all. I wish I'd known this while Dad was still alive, Iris said quietly. I wish I could have thanked him for that, or asked him more about it directly. I think he would have wanted you to know, Genevieve said. I think he carried his own version of this silence too, in his own way. I don't think either of us ever fully forgave ourselves for how long we let the not telling go on, once you were old enough that it might have actually helped you to hear it. Iris began, in the weeks that followed, allowing herself small, deliberate acts of hope she had previously been withholding. Telling a few more close friends about the pregnancy, letting Desmond help her set up the smallest beginnings of a nursery, permitting herself, cautiously, to imagine a future she had been keeping at careful arm's length since the early scare. She asked her mother one afternoon whether she might teach her some sign language of her own, not out of any medical necessity, but as a way of honoring both the sister she would never know and the specific, hard-won hope her mother had eventually rebuilt after losing her. I'd like that very much, Genevieve said, her eyes bright. I don't think I ever expected to teach this to you directly. I think some part of me always assumed the language would just remain my own private thing, connected to a grief I'd decided you didn't need access to. I think I'd like it to become something we actually share instead. They met weekly after that, Genevieve patient and precise in her instruction the way she had been with countless students across 4 decades, though Iris noticed, in the specific tenderness her mother brought to these particular lessons, something considerably more personal than professional habit, the quiet, accumulating sense of a promise finally, after nearly 40 years, being passed forward rather than carried alone. Iris found the lessons themselves unexpectedly steadying during the anxious middle months of her pregnancy. An hour each week, where her attention narrowed entirely to the careful shape of her own hands, to her mother's patient corrections, to a language that asked for nothing except presence and precision. She began practicing on her own between sessions, signing small phrases to Desmond over dinner, to her own reflection in the bathroom mirror while she brushed her teeth, building the same quiet, private fluency her mother had once built alone, decades earlier, in the months before Noor was born. I think I understand now why you kept going, even after, Iris told her mother, midway through one of their sessions, her hands working slowly through a phrase Genevieve had just taught her. There's something in the doing of it that doesn't require the outcome to be certain. You just keep practicing, and the practicing itself becomes its own kind of hope, whether or not you know yet how the story ends. That's exactly it, Genevieve said, her eyes bright. I don't think I ever explained it that clearly to myself, even after all these years. I think you just did. Iris gave birth to a healthy daughter the following winter, choosing, after careful thought and a conversation with her mother that neither of them fully finished without tears, a middle name that honored the sister she had only learned about months earlier, Eleanor Noor Colton. I don't want her to grow up not knowing, Iris told her mother, holding her newborn daughter in the same kitchen where she had first learned the truth. I want her to understand from the very beginning that she has an aunt who never got the chance to be born, and that some of the love in this family started with her, even though she was never here to receive it directly. Genevieve held her granddaughter for a long time that afternoon, signing the same small nursery rhymes she had once practiced, decades earlier, for a daughter who never had the chance to hear or see them. Iris watched her mother's hands move through the familiar shapes, unhurried and precise, and understood that she was witnessing something considerably larger than an ordinary grandmother's first visit, a promise made in a hospital room nearly 40 years earlier, finally finding its way, at last, into hands small enough to eventually carry it forward themselves. Genevieve visited often in the months that followed, teaching her granddaughter simple signs alongside her first spoken words, the same patient, unhurried instruction she had once begun, decades earlier, for a daughter who would never have the chance to use it. She kept a small notebook, Iris noticed, tracking Eleanor's first successful signs the way new parents sometimes track a baby's first words. Milk, more, mama. Each small success recorded with the same careful attention Genevieve had once brought to a pregnancy that never reached its own first milestones. On a quiet afternoon the following spring, sitting together in Iris's living room, while baby Eleanor slept between them, Genevieve told her something she said she'd been meaning to say since the retirement banquet months earlier. "I think I finally understand something," she said, "that took me almost 40 years and a very late, overdue conversation with my own daughter to actually learn. I think grief that doesn't get spoken eventually finds other ways to speak for itself. A whole career built quietly around an unexplained devotion. A daughter growing up sensing something important beneath the surface of her mother's ordinary habits without ever understanding what it was. I don't think I meant to keep it from you as completely as I did. I think I simply didn't know, for a very long time, that silence could shape a life just as thoroughly as speech, whether or not you ever meant it to." Iris looked at her sleeping daughter, at the small, careful signs Genevieve had already begun teaching her, and thought about a sister she would never meet, whose brief, unlived life had nonetheless shaped, quietly and completely, the entire architecture of the family Iris had grown up inside without ever fully understanding why. "I think you're allowed to have not known how to say it sooner," she told her mother gently. "I think that's part of what I'm still learning too, that some of the most important things in a family get passed down not through what's explained clearly, but through what's simply lived, faithfully, for as long as it takes someone to finally ask the right question." Genevieve reached over and signed something to her granddaughter, a small, gentle motion, "Love," before repeating it once more with her voice, the way she had for 41 years, standing quietly at the edge of other people's most important moments, making certain that nothing essential was ever lost in the space between two languages, or between a mother and the daughter she had spent nearly 4 decades learning how to finally tell the whole truth.